What if the guilt you feel after setting a boundary doesn't mean you've done something wrong, but simply that you're doing something different? Stay tuned as we explore guilt during personal growth, why healthy change can feel uncomfortable at first, and how to know when guilt is and isn't a stop sign. Welcome back to the Resilient MD, the podcast and YouTube channel where we have honest conversations about medicine, burnout, resilience, and how to care for others without losing ourselves in the process. I'm your host, Dr. Anna McDowell, certified life coach, allergist, and firm believer that small changes can create massive ripple effects. I'm so glad you're here today because we're going to talk about an emotion that has influenced many of our decisions, often without us even realizing it. It's an emotion that can make us question ourselves, reverse healthy decisions, and keep us stuck in patterns that no longer serve us. That emotion is guilt. In my experience, one of the most confusing aspects of personal growth is that doing something healthier doesn't always feel better at first. We often expect that when we make a good decision, we'll feel immediately relieved or at peace. But that's not always what happens. Sometimes the very first emotion we feel is guilt. Today, I'd like to explore why that happens and why guilt is not always the signal we think it is. If you remember in last week's episode, I shared this story of a boundary I eventually created in the clinic I used to work. For years, I allowed myself to be interrupted while I was seeing patients. Staff would come in with administrative questions, scheduling issues, or questions about other patients. Every interruption seemed small, and because I wanted to be helpful, I had this open door policy and generally stopped what I was doing to answer. Eventually, I realized those interruptions were affecting far more than my schedule. They were affecting the quality of my thinking. Every time I stepped away mentally from the task in front of me, it could be a patient that I was seeing or an email I was formulating, I had to reconstruct my reasoning before I could continue again. I was also making administrative decisions without always having the information I really needed because I was trying to answer quickly. So I made a change. Unless something was truly urgent, we would wait until I had finished with all my patients before discussing administrative issues or unrelated clinic questions. What I didn't tell you last week was what happened after I made that decision. I felt guilty. I wondered whether my staff would think I had become difficult. I worried that I wasn't being a good team player anymore. I questioned whether I was making everyone else's job harder. Looking back now, it's almost interesting to remember those thoughts because none of them turn out to be true. The patients received better care because they had my full attention. My staff received better answers because I had the time to think through their questions instead of responding while I'm mentally divided. The clinic became more efficient. That boundary I created ended up improving things for everyone. The guilt disappeared long before the benefits did. That experience taught me something I've carried with me ever since. Feeling guilty doesn't automatically mean we're doing something wrong. Over the years, both in coaching and in my own life, I've noticed that many women use guilt almost like a compass. It's like they think that if they feel guilty, they must have made the wrong decision. But in reality, guilt is much more complicated emotion than that. It has multiple layers. Sometimes guilt is incredibly helpful. If we've hurt someone, if we've acted in a way that doesn't reflect our values, if we have broken trust, guilt invites us to repair. It is an important emotion, but there's another kind of guilt that isn't about wrongdoing at all. It is the kind of guilt that appears when we begin behaving differently than people have become accustomed to. Those are two very different experiences. Unfortunately, they often feel exactly the same. A few years ago, I noticed yet another pattern in my own life. Every time I traveled to Brazil to visit my family, they would ask me to bring things from the United States. Sometimes there were small items that were difficult to find there. Sometimes there were things that were simply less expensive here. It made me happy to be able to do these things for them. The problem wasn't what they were asking for. The problem was when they were asking. It wasn't unusual for someone to send me a message the day before my flight asking if I could still bring one more thing. They would message me something like, "Can you get me that bubble gum I like?" Or, "Jinda, my nieces are my goddaughters. I need this eyeliner, please." And because I hate to disappoint people, I would always say yes. Then I'd spend the last day before my trip driving all over town, looking for one item after another. Remember, I was also working full time, taking care of a household, and getting ready to travel internationally. By the time I finally got on the plane, I was exhausted, frustrated, and if I'm being honest, a little resentful. Not because I didn't love my family, but because I had created a situation that wasn't sustainable. Eventually, I decided to try something different. I told everyone that I would be happy to bring whatever they needed, but I needed them to let me know by the weekend before my trip. That gave me time to organize everything without turning the last few days before traveling into a scavenger hunt across town. It sounds like a small change. It was really hard to stick to my rule too. The first time I said, "I'm sorry, but I don't have time to look for it anymore. You should have asked by the weekend like we planned." Oh my goodness, that almost killed me inside. The first few times I did it, I felt terrible. It was horrible. I remember thinking they were going to feel disappointed, that they might think I wasn't willing to help anymore, that somehow I was letting them down. Well, none of that happened. People simply adjusted. In fact, I enjoyed my visit so much more because I wasn't arriving already mentally and physically depleted. The requests didn't stop. The relationship didn't suffer. The only thing that changed was the timing. And that small boundary made all of us happier. Before we move on, I want to pause for a moment. I'm curious, have you been feeling exhausted, discouraged, or frustrated and not quite sure why? Are you quietly wondering if this is just how life in medicine has to be? Well, I see you. You don't have to give up on yourself or your dreams. And the good news is that you don't have to figure it all out alone. I built a 6-week one-on-one coaching program designed to help women physicians gently remove the barriers keeping them stuck and rediscover clarity, balance, and purpose. It is called the Resilient MD, just like the podcast and YouTube channel. If you are ready, you can begin today. Schedule your free clarity call. The link is in the show's notes. Looking back, I find both of those stories fascinating because they taught me the same exact lesson. The guilt I felt wasn't telling me that I had done something wrong. It was telling me that I had done something differently. There's an important distinction there. Research in family system psychology suggests that every family, every workplace, and every long term relationship develop patterns over time. Without realizing it, we all begin expecting one another to play certain roles. One person becomes the organizer, another becomes the caretaker, another becomes the one who always says yes. Another becomes a dependable problem solver. Over time, those patterns begin to feel normal. Psychologists refer to this tendency as homeostasis. This term is borrowed from physiology and refers to the body's ability to maintain a stable internal environment despite external changes. So here it is referring to the natural inclination of a system, in this case the family, my family, to return to what is familiar. When one person changes, even in a healthy way, the entire system notices, not because the change is wrong, because the system has to adapt. That change causes a ripple effect and leads to small changes in everyone involved. The adjustment period often feels uncomfortable, including to the person making the change. I think this is especially relevant for physicians. Throughout our career, we become accustomed to disappoint people professionally. Patients may want antibiotics they don't need. They may request testing that isn't medically indicated. They may want appointments sooner than the schedule allows. As physicians, we understand that saying no doesn't necessarily mean we're failing our patients. Sometimes saying no is exactly what good care requires. What's interesting is how difficult it becomes to apply that same wisdom to ourselves. Somehow, in our personal lives, disappointing someone often feels like evidence that we've done something wrong. But disappointment and harm are not the same thing. Someone can be disappointed because you protected your time. Someone can be disappointed because you couldn't attend an event. Someone can be disappointed because you set a boundary. Their disappointment is a real emotion, but it doesn't automatically mean your decision was wrong. One of the things we've learned over the past few years is that growth often feels unfamiliar before it feels comfortable. If you've spent decades saying yes immediately, your first thoughtful no will probably feel very uncomfortable. If you've always placed yourself last, your first decision to honor your own needs may feel selfish. If you've always been available to everyone at every moment, protecting your attention may initially feel like you're letting people down. Those feelings don't necessarily mean you've taken a wrong turn. Sometimes they simply mean you've walking a road that you've never walked before. So the next time guilt shows up after you've made a thoughtful decision, I would encourage you to pause before changing course. Ask yourself two simple questions. Have I acted against my values? Or am I simply acting differently than I used to? Those questions will lead you to powerful answers. Some of the healthiest decisions I've ever made were uncomfortable at first. Not because they were wrong, because they were new. And that is exactly what growth feels like. Remember, my wings grow when I listen. If this episode resonated with you, consider sharing it with a colleague who might need this reminder today. Sometimes the right message reaches us through someone who simply thought of us. Next week, we will talk about how fear of judgment delays meaningful life decisions. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode of the show. Before you leave, make sure to download the free People Pleasing Reflection Guide, because sometimes awareness begins simply by finally asking yourself the questions you've been too busy to hear. You'll find the link in the description below. Let's grow this community together. If this episode served you, please take just a few moments to leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcast or your favorite platform and like this video on YouTube. It's one of the best ways to help more people hear this message. And if you have some moments to spare, please leave some kind words as a review. It will really help the show, and I will really appreciate it. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Until next week, be gentle with yourself. Growth doesn't always feel comfortable, but that doesn't mean you are moving in the wrong direction. I'm Dr. Anna McDowell, a resilient MD just like you. I'll see you next week.